Hello there, I'm Luke Ford, and I'm here with Professor Tracy Strong. And Professor Strong has a new book coming out from the University of Chicago Press. It's entitled Learning One's Native Tongue. So we just did a previous interview, but because of the poor sound quality, we're going to try it again. So once again, Professor Strong, please talk to me about your new book on citizenship. It's called Learning One's Native Tongue, Citizenship, Contestation, and Conflict in America.
Thank you, Luke. This book has its origins in a set of realizations that have come to me partly while teaching, partly while trying to understand what's going on in the country. Some of it has to do with what I discovered in my students increasingly, with an almost complete lack of any historical sense of American politics, so that things that happened 50, 60, 100 years ago could have happened 1,000 years ago, which is completely. The second realization was the fact that most political theory, written at least in English, since the Second World War, has one central characteristic, which was one had to make sure that it would never happen again. It, of course, was National Socialism. So it was written to avoid the kind of intensity of feeling which was associated with National Socialism. A Yale political scientist, Robert Lane, once wrote that for democracy to succeed, American democracy, one had to have what he said, a touch of anomie, that is, of not caring too much. So this struck me as something that we actually investigated. Now, as this book took shape, I realized that it actually was a kind of continuation of previous concerns, even though in some senses different. Much of my previous work on sort of European political thought. A previous book, Politics Without Vision, tried to explore sources for a possible recovery or extinction of democratic theory by looking at political theorists as philosophers who were actually not Democrats, and talk about that. One, I finished that, came out, then I wrote Learning One's. And basically what that book tries to do, one can find resources for a vibrant, vigorous notion of citizenship and public space in American history. Much of those resources have been covered over by sort of this thing about what's right, but also what's wrong with them. And in that sense, I go back in the book to the Puritans, which is where everything starts, and trace it through American history chronologically down to the present, social media, and the question of terrorism. The argument is, in fact, that there exists in American experience substance for a recovery of a much more vigorous notion of citizenship than has been generally previously thought. That recovery requires, in some sense, learning about it. And what the book tries to do is show how these resources manifested themselves throughout the course of America. What this means, the idea of citizenship in the book is conceived of not so much as a right, but is conceived of as the meeting of a set of criteria which, when met, entitles one to call oneself citizen. Now, once you talk about it that way, obviously the criteria change over time. The country gets bigger, the country expands, the country changes economically, the country goes into the international sphere. This means that the criteria are constantly in a subject of contestation, and sometimes of violent conflict, as in, shall we say, attempt in the book then is to to investigate what the criteria are at any particular time, how they change over time, and how they are contested over time, and what is gained and what is lost in each of those particular changes. Just an example, in Puritan New England, to be a fully participant citizen, you had to be a church member. Now, on one hand, this is theocracy and bad. On the other hand, the reason you had a church member is because if you were a church member, it meant that you manifested an adequate amount of public virtue in order to be entitled to participate in the running of your state or country's affairs. So that kind of contestation, obviously church membership is no longer the criterion, but it's investigation of those sorts of criteria that I tried to do, and some sense of gradual thinning out of the criteria for being a citizen that have happened over time. That's what the book tries to do. It goes, as I say, from beginning to somewhere beyond the end. But I wound up being quite pleased.
Now, is there an American nation? There is an American state, but there are so many different nations within America. I'm curious, do you view the United States of America as a nation?
Mm-hmm. Well, the question comes, what is the relationship and the nature of the relationship between the various, shall we say, subcategories in the country, and how do they relate to each other? To the degree that they tend to be identity focused, the degree that they tend to be issue focused, there is as it were no nation. On the other hand, I lived in California for over 30 years. California is presently, don't count Hispanics as white, no question, is less than 50% white. There is nonetheless something more of, shall we say, unity or a commonality is the word I prefer. There is elsewhere. It is also the case that we are increasingly, as part of the distress manifest, especially in the latter part of the book, we're increasingly, in fact, not a nation, but in fact a set of fragments which have very little to do with each other and basically don't interact. If there's any hope to the book, and maybe to the next, one can show, in fact, that this has not always been so, and perhaps need not always be so. So I must say, with the present political leadership, with the present the effects of the effects of big data, and terrorism, achieving something, covering something from the past.
So I'm looking at the book description, and it talks about the writings of speeches of John Winthrop, Roger Williams, Thomas Jefferson, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, and Franklin Roosevelt. America was by and large founded by Englishmen, and its legal system and political system largely influenced by the English. Can what is essentially an Anglo-Saxon system keep working when Anglo-Saxons are, 10-15% of the United States?
So the question becomes, what do we do about what happens?
Yeah, we have a system that was developed by Anglo-Saxons, largely for Anglo-Saxons. How?
No, I think you are. I would say that's a standard ploy. But in fact, the people who came over, Anglo-Saxons, but also the immigrants who came, after them, are very clear that they're trying to do something which has not been done. Now, they conceive of that, you're quite correct, in their own rather parochial terms. But the concept is not itself parochial. The concept is, in fact, wide open. So that this means that America, in some senses, has always been a project, has always been something in process, and never something actually achieved. And one has to, I would argue, has to recover the notion that this is an unfinished project, and it is, in fact, essence of American citizenship, in fact, to try to continue that project. This does not require being Anglo-Saxon, though for some people, of course, argue that it does. There's no particular need or reason for that, except that one wants to want to protect themselves and they feel threatened. Sources of that threat are, of course, important to investigate. But I resist the notion that because the founders originally were white Europeans, essentially, that their project is necessarily limited to that. That's how I would respond there.
So when you say America is a project, are you saying that America is an idea?
Yes.
A proposition?
Unrealized.
A proposition nation?
A proposition, an enterprise unfinished, and clearly unaccomplished. It's also, if you go back and you read, even Hamilton or Winthrop, they're very clear that it is a project, it is what you're calling a proposition, I think. They're also very clear that one has to be extremely anxious about whether or not one's doing right. Or if we fail in this enterprise, says Winthrop, we shall be a byword to the nations, and God will withdraw his blessing from us, and so forth and so on. So there's what goes along with the notion of a project is an enormous anxiety of, are we doing it right yet? And that produces a great deal of I think, often problematic. But there's Margaret Thatcher, who's someone I don't normally cite, once said, in fact, that between America and Britain is founded on a history, and America is founded on an idea. And there's, I think, some truth to that.
What would you think Carl Schmidt would think about what you're saying?
Schmidt disliked America. He disliked America because he thought it was messy. He disliked America because it was not homogeneous enough. He disliked America the way he disliked the Soviet Union. And a lot of Europeans, including Habermas, Heidegger, and people shared actually that opinion. The contestation notion in the subtitle of this book is actually important. You have to have contestation is not a fight to the death, so what it should be. Contestation is in fact a contest where there's going to be winners, there are going to be losers, but you're still part of the same contest and you're in the same actually race. You can't contest against someone unless you share the fact that you're in the same project or the same race. Schmidt wants homogeneity. One of the reasons that Schmidt expresses, as he does, not so much anti-Semitic as anti-Judean sentiments, is that he thinks that Jews, in fact, are not fully part of Germany. That is, they share an allegiance to Israel, or potential Israel, and so forth. It's actually much like what Hobbes and Locke said. You can't have Catholics, says Hobbes, because Catholics can't be fully English because they owe loyalty to the Pope. distressed with America, and he has spent his life really, I think, trying in some sense to resist this notion of a kind of, shall we say, pluralistic contestation or agonism that have what we should have.
But Schmidt was also fairly well read in the founding documents of America. How well do you think Schmidt understood America?
Well, hard to answer the question. He certainly was well read. He was extremely widely read, and people, the people who were impressed by him cover the political spectrum from far left to right, to far right. In his own terms, I think he understood America. He understood America in his own terms. It is not something he, given the emphasis, shall we say, upon a certain kind of homogeneity and a certain kind of similarity between members of a particular state, he could not have liked it. But that's his. But did he understand America the way I'm trying to understand America? No. Did he understand it in his own terms and have, counted for him as evidence? Yes.
You blew my mind when I was reading your book, Politics Without Vision, when you noted that Woodrow Wilson and Vladimir Lenin had more in common than they did with Clemenceau and Lloyd George. And so as I listen to you here, I'm thinking both the Soviet Union and the United States then are empires based on an idea. But
absolutely. No, that's absolutely correct. And that argument was originally made by a Princeton historian, Arno Mayer. And one of the things, this is one of the reasons why, this goes back to your Schmidt question, one of the reasons, one of the similarities there is that both the United States and the Soviet Union are founded upon essentially a universalistic idea. What we do here is valid for everyone, or should become valid for everyone. That's not Schmidt. That's not Europe. That's why European thinkers from Max Weber through Heidegger, through Habermas, through Schmidt, and so forth, say, essentially say a plague in both your houses. We don't like either. I mean, Habermas tries to take things from American thought and so forth, but basically, what his worry is Europe, and Europe as not being, as it were, universalistic. There are problems with this. The problems with America is that when America engages, starting at the end of the 19th century, in expanding abroad, Philippines, Cuba, Guam, etc., so forth, it does so not in a standard colonialist way. It does so on the grounds, and people are quite explicit about it. Henry Cabot Lodge was. We're going to make these people into good Americans. They aren't there yet, but what we're bringing them are the virtues of being an American. And you say, really the Iraq War. Same thing, obviously, with the Soviet Union, which is what we're doing here, building socialism, communism, is in fact eventually should be a worldwide medium. That's a universalism here has its attractive qualities. People are equal. It has its dangerous qualities, which is it allows you to justify a huge range of things. And one has to think, one thinks here obviously goes back to the American adventures abroad, starting really with the Spanish-American War, I suppose, and going right down through Vietnam, Iraq, and so on, and the present.
So when
please you pick that.
Yeah. So when Schmidt thought that only a democracy could be, only a homogeneous nation could be democratic, it wasn't really so much It wasn't was it a faith statement on behalf of Schmidt, or that he thought that the nation should be coterminous with the state, right? So he had reasons for thinking that. It wasn't just like a bizarre statement of faith, even though it seems that way to an American.
He had reasons. And actually, he got into trouble in the middle, like 36, 37. He got into trouble because what doing that did was to underplay the role of the party, the Nazi party. And he was severely criticized by the official organ of the Gestapo. It was protected by Goering, but essentially after that, sort of shut up and stopped talking about the domestic things and focused mostly on international law things. He claims to have been very close to arrested by Gestapo.
Right, but he saw that the nation should be coterminous with the state. Is that correct?
Yes, but that leaves out the party, and that was not acceptable to the Nazi, a range of Nazi ideologues.
So, I mean, Schmidt would have approved of Japan. That would have been a homogeneous society, and Australia. At that time was homogeneous, so he thought that a nation that was also a state, or a state that was also a nation, was going to have much more internal coherence. And
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. At the end of his life, he has some very favorable things in a book on partisanship about Mao Zedong, of all things, who might share. You might argue shares some of what you just said. It's quite it's quite astonishing that his must have been in the late 70s or 80s when he writes this.
So I want to repeat a question that I asked earlier, but because of audio, I didn't really get to hear your full answer. So Schmidt's friend-enemy distinction is depends upon homogeneity. So can a diverse nation like the United States really have an enemy in the Schmidtian sense?
Well, the friend-foe distinction, the friend-enemy distinction is tricky. Let's take it first on the obvious sort of state-to-state international relations framework. What it reminds me of is, what makes me think of, is a speech that was given in the United States in 1985 by Georgy Arbatov, who was a member of the Central Committee of the Soviet Union. And Arbatov, addressing an American audience, said, in 1985, thus before the Soviet Union disappears, said, "We're going to do a terrible thing to you. We're going to take away your enemy." Now, what Arbatov understood in that is that an essential part of the way Americans were tending to conceive of themselves, an essential part of the way Americans formulated their own identity as Americans, required the existence of an external enemy. This is actually, to some degree, quite in line with the sorts of things Schmidt says. Now, if you explore that way, that thought a bit more, what you find, in fact, is that it actually repeats, can be said to derive from something which one finds in all places in Nietzsche, who was incidentally the subject of my first book. Always nice to see coherence in one's life. Nietzsche has a doctrine which he calls the doctrine of ressentiment, resentment. And resentment essentially says is a way of thinking of oneself which depends upon one not being what one's enemy is. Now, push that one step further, what you realize is that to the degree that you conceive of yourself as not being what your enemy is, you have to have an enemy. And it's to your interest to make sure that you always do have an enemy. And in this sense, this is, I think, the kind of tendency, kind of role that the friend-enemy plays to some degree in Schmidt. People have often criticized Schmidt for placing more emphasis upon the enemy side of that equation than on the friend side. So there, the degree of America's conception of itself, which was not always the case, but is increasingly the case, certainly with the Cold War, and actually starting really about 1990. Degree that America's conception of itself depends upon having an enemy, it will always make sure that it has an enemy. The latest, of course, being the war on terrorism. Now, if one tries to take the friend-enemy distinction now internally, that is domestically, there's where you get the homogeneity argument in Schmidt. That's the problem with Jews, that they're not really us. They're our enemy. And write a number of things which are pretty openly anti-Semitic. What I call anti-Judaic, actually. This goes back to the question you were asking before, which is the question really about exactly what is the contestation. And to contest something is not precisely to define yourself against an enemy. You aren't necessarily not the person who is second in the race or who the other person in the race. You are sharing in some sense a race. And insofar as you don't then define yourself as, pardon the jargon, the negation of the negation, that is, as not being what you're not, the friend-enemy distinction becomes attenuated or becomes, I think, more fruitful than the way I see it play, the role I see it playing in Carl Schmitt.
You have a fascinating sentence in the introduction to in your introduction to the University of Chicago's publication of Schmidt's concept of the political. And I just want to read you this one sentence that grabbed me. An intellectual consequence of the experience with Nazism was to effectively shrink, perhaps one might say homogenize, the language and terms of political debate in the subsequent period. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, it goes back to some of the things I was saying at the beginning of the interview. The experience of Nazism is just, for most Americans now, certainly young Americans, is it could have been Qishu Huangdi, the Chinese emperor in 200 BC. I mean, it's just not part of their consciousnesses. There are some exceptions to this, certainly if you're Jewish, but that's increasingly it's not the case. This means that we are, well, this has had two consequences. The first is really that the political theory which has been written does not deal adequately with the fact that increasingly the young, but increasingly the majority of the population, the resistance to Nazism is relevant. I'm just phenomenally struck by the ease with which one apparently can now today in the United States display Nazi symbols, display Nazi slogans, speak in manners which are remarkably similar to the way Nazi propaganda worked in the 30s and so forth, without it being, in some sense, a particular problem. And the danger here is not that we're going to fall back into National Socialism. The danger here is that politics will develop in such a way that we will, in fact, recreate some version of a kind of a centralized, professionalized authoritarianism, which will essentially undercut any sense of public space, any sense of democratic politics and democratic participation. That the part of the point of the that quote you take is from an introduction to one of the Schmidt books. In some sense, it was to try to deal with that, to try to show, in fact, that one could find other resources in American thought, in American history, for a vibrant or vigorous notion of American citizenship, which have generally been a path for increasing word undercut. When I reread, for the purposes of this new book, the Port Huron Statement, which was the founding document of Students for Democracy, when I reread it, I was struck by the fact that there was not one reference to any figure in American history. It was as if somehow there was complete ignorance that there were any resources to draw upon. That's what I've been trying in this new book to overcome, and the feeling of the need for that is present already in the citation from that introduction which you cited.
A friend of mine makes the claim that politics in the Western world died in Hitler's bunker in 1945, in that because the working class in Germany had voted for the Nazis, all sorts of issues had to be taken off the table for political debate, such as immigration. Like, immigration has largely been considered essentially off the table. The Americans have not had the opportunity, perhaps until Trump, to vote for a major party favoring significant immigration restriction since World War II. So immigration and a lot of other issues seem to have been largely taken off the table, taken out of the realm of politics, and purely decided by elites since World War II. Is there anything to that?
There's something to that, but I think it goes back before that. If you look at the amount of time that people served in the House of Representatives in the 19th century, the average duration of the time a representative served was about 1.6 terms. In other words, people went to Washington for a relatively period of time, and they came back to their state. When Lincoln was in the House of Representatives, he explicitly said he would be going only for one term. You can't imagine that sort of thing happening now. With a set of reforms that happened, so-called the canon reforms, after the turn of the century, increasingly politics becomes a professional sport. That is, it becomes a job. It becomes a career. This was not the case in the 19th century. Once it becomes a career, it becomes politics becomes in the hands of the elite, and the elite eventually make those decisions, and their connection with, as it were, should we say, the amateur side of politics becomes increasingly, I think, limited. So I think that the dying of it, as it were, started well before his death in the bunker. But it is the case that now tend to think of political decisions made by people who are professional experts. Their job. One of the points I make about Lenin in the Politics Without Vision book is that one of the striking things about the way Lenin conceives of a revolutionary, that being a revolutionary is like having a job. He says you should be a revolutionary, not, he says, a wretched amateur. Yet, what enhances this is a sense, again, becoming much stronger after the turn of the 20th century, that huge number of decisions can be resolved technologically or, quote, scientifically. Technologically is a better word. And that, again, is the province of experts. So that instead of decisions made, as it were, popularly, in a popular manner, they are, in fact, put over to experts. Now, we now have an interesting set of conflict about what constitutes expertise, but there's no question that political elite sees as its role the making of those decisions by and on itself. I was always struck by one thing that George W. Bush said at one point in a speech where he said, people asked him, well, how would this be decided? And he said, I am the decider. And I have to believe that one of his speechwriters at that point had been reading Carl Schmidt. Because that's pure Carl Schmidt.
Right. So
the Schmidt emphasis on sovereignty and so forth goes along with this notion of elites, and and that those things go very much together. Let me just since 1975 or 6, there have been over 500 laws passed which give to the president the right to act unilaterally under conditions of his own determination. Now, most of those are more or less inoffensive. But for instance, when Katrina hit Louisiana, the president called in the National Guard. Now, the National Guard can actually only be called in by the state governor unless the president declares a state of emergency, which a law had given him the right to do so. So when you can declare a state of emergency, and you have these over 500 laws permitting this in various circumstances, exception becomes the rule. I mean, everything is potentially an exception at that point. And once everything's an exception, again, becomes the province of Italy.
So I recently finished a 1,000-page biography of Enoch Powell, and I was struck that when he gave his famous speech about immigration, he had the support of 80% plus of the British public, but the elites were against him 99-1, and so there was never a chance that the policies that 80% plus of the British public wanted were ever going to be enacted because the elites were opposed 99-1. Is this an example of the restriction of political discourse because Enoch Powell violated those restrictions? He was therefore outside the bounds of what the elites decided were acceptable, and even though the overwhelming majority of the British public sided with Powell, there was never a chance that that could be enacted into law.
Well, what's the date of that speech, Jim?
Something like 1968. I will look it up as you talk about that idea.
It's certainly not the
1968. 1968.
68. Yeah, that's interesting. You take an ex-colonial country, which at a certain point had given citizenship rights to all of members of its colonies, and then I think Powell wanted to restrict that. What does one say to this? I mean, one says, British have restricted. Let me jump down to the present. The present, is clearly no longer that kind of situation in the sense that you find elites also, or a certain section of the elites, clearly in favor of restricting immigration. The immigration question in England is very particular because of that what was then, I think, the law, which is anybody from a former colony was entitled to become a citizen. This produces, especially when you've lost your colonies and when you have a whole bunch of people whose experience of the 45 to 68 is the so-called decline of Britain. I'm not surprised by the result. What I am impressed by now is the elites no longer think that, or at least a significant portion of them. The bigger question you raise here is how one deals with the question of immigration. And there are obviously multiple aspects to it. People seeking asylum, people wanting a better life, people coming from someplace else. The difficulty here is what criteria should one place upon being admitted as an immigrant? And I don't have a good answer to that. I think it has to be thought of in terms of what would, in fact, be what it would mean to be a full member of a particular society, of a particular country in the United States, and so forth, and how that could, over time, be achieved. It is probably the case that the simply open borders solution is not going to be acceptable, and I think it's ultimately problematic because you'll get situations where, in fact, and this goes back to some of the Schmidt'ian themes you were raising before, you do not want people not to be part of, as it were, to participate, shall we say, in what I'm calling the contest or the contestation. If people come to, for instance, Germany and simply use being in Germany as a way of supporting themselves without ever, in some sense, becoming part of the society, and that's difficult because part of the society doesn't mean homogeneity. That's what I was not calling contestation here. Then you have a problem. The Germans have tried to deal that with the Gastarbeiter, or the guest worker situation, which is frankly basically a form of exploitation. On the other hand, there are things that existed in Switzerland, for instance. To become a citizen in some of the Swiss cantons, you have to be what's called in French reçu par la commune, as received by the particular district in which you live. That is, your name goes on the ballot. Shall this person become a citizen? One of the things you find that happens in a lot of places in Switzerland is that people who have been there for a long time, who are perfectly integrated into the society, who speak perfect Swiss German, and so forth, are denied the right to become citizens, and they all have Turkish last names. Now, that's a problem. On the other hand, it's a problem because they are, in some sense, members. One can't avoid the fact that one has to deal with a certain amount of racism. One has to deal, in which case it seems to be an enormous amount of distress over what has been actually lost. That is with the empire and so forth. There was a poll recently done of people in England who will vote Conservative for the Tory party, and I think something close to 40% of them said that they were willing to accept a no-deal Brexit, even if it meant that Scotland and Northern Ireland split off, and if it meant an economic depression. That's an astonishing figure. And it shows you, in some sense, how some sense of being English very problematically bound up in what's our relationship to the European Union and a desire not to be part of that relationship. It is actually one of the reasons why de Gaulle vetoed the entry of the British 3 times, I believe, simply because he knew the British would never, in fact, become part of the EU. You've got, there's not a magic solution. And, it's simplistic to say it, but it's true.
Let's use a Schmidt'ian thought experiment. Let's say the sovereign was able to, against the will of the elites, end immigration, pause immigration using extra legal means, and he had the support of, let's say, 80% of the public, even though the elites were opposed to him. So that would be the sovereign acting in a state of exception to really embody the democratic will by bypassing democratic processes. Is that an accurate thought experiment?
It depends on what you call the democratic will. I mean, it depends on what you want to call democracy. If your notion of democracy is in fact, you were essentially invoking a Schmidtian notion of democracy, of homogeneity there. If that's your notion of democracy, then you can vote, bypassing the democratic will. The part of, in fact, notion of, in fact, is, should we say, the working of the friend-enemy distinction, that we were talking about before, is that, no, that's not democracy. I mean, it is perfectly possible. Make a distinction that comes from, say, another book that I wrote on Rousseau. Rousseau distinguishes between what he calls the will of all, which is your 80%, and the general will. The general will has to do with what it is that makes one a people, a commonality. It has to do with that which is the same in everyone. Exactly the same. Rousseau always was stressed by actions which, in fact, enforced the will of all, because he said that is not what makes, that is not, as it were, an accurate representation of what makes the society. Now, the question one's implicitly asking here, what makes America American? And if you ask that question, it seems to me that saying the 80% of the people don't want immigration, or percent of the people only want people who comes above $500,000 or whatever, or only want people with high education and so forth. That's what when saying America is. Well, that's an argument to be had. I don't think that's what it is, but the inherent question is, there's something called being an American, which is not necessarily the same as the wall, and not necessarily the same as taking the poll and finding that 80% agree on this or on that. Hard to ignore the 80% because, but it doesn't necessarily make them correct about what they are. And look, for instance, at the arguments that took place during the time of the Red Scare and so forth. The arguments of the people on the left is, even though a significant portion of the country agreed with what the government, FBI, the loyalty boards, and so forth were doing, The argument is that's not what America is. And if that's not what America is, then you have a pathology. And there's a lot of pathology going on in the States now. As there is.
So you're saying that the choices of 80% plus of the population may be incorrect and a pathology based on what? Because they don't accord with the particular conception of America as an idea?
Well, then this is the point of writing is trying to show that there is there has been a conception of America as which is other than what we're attributing now to this percent. I just don't think that democracy is resolved by saying what's the majority, the 50% plus one, or 80% or whatever. I don't think that one question what democracy is resolved by that. It has to do with a certain kind of participation. It has to do with a certain kind of activity and decision making.
Okay.
This is a difficult question because this is a difficult question because clearly there is force in the notion of the 80%. On the other hand, if 80% all right to arrest people because should we say because they're homosexuals, one has to ask: is that in fact part of what is guaranteed to us by the Constitution?
Okay, so right and wrong is referring to a text such as the Constitution. Does that become the basis or a basis of what people are allowed to vote for?
Well, the Constitution is the basis in the sense that it is that which constitutes what we are. That said, it is notoriously open to interpretation and understanding. It's notoriously, flexible, and the part of what happens is that over time it is understood in increasingly difficult ways. I mean, Bowers versus Hardwick, the homosexual. The homosexuality case and so forth, in the end, derives from a reading of certain acts of liberty and association and privacy, which come to be seen to have a constitutional basis. Is there something which the Constitution could there be changes made in the Constitution such that one no longer recognizes oneself as what one was? Yes. I don't know what would happen then. That's a revolution. I mean, take the following parallel case. If you play chess, you have to play according to the rules which constitute the game of chess. So if someone says, well, I want to play chess and I'm going to move the bishop on on the horizontals, the diagonals. That's no longer chess. If, on the other hand, someone says, I want to play chess, but let's play without the rule of Jadub, which is the rule that if you touch a piece, you have to move it, that's still probably playing chess. What's the limit to what can be changed in the American Constitution and still have it be American? Well, the 14th Amendment, the amendments ending slavery, the amendments giving women the right to vote, are changes which took 100 years or more to achieve, and do not, in the end, destroy or radically change what it means to be an American. They change it somewhat, but one is still in the same family. Can one imagine changes going on? They're going on now. The sort of this assumption of overweening executive power on the part of the president, which, if institutionalized, change what it means to be an American? I think so. And that's why we're in very dangerous times of this. I mean, the combination of what you were talking before about the rule by elites, the combination of the valorization of professionalism, the combination of the incredible extension of executive power, and the transformation of the legislature into essentially a branch of the executive, or at least the Senate that way. All of those are portend changes which would, if they become institutionalized, really change the fabric of what it meant to be an American. Can that happen? Yes. And will one know that something has happened? One hopes so.
So I was.
If you look, go ahead.
Oh, I was struck when you used the word pathologize in the thought experiment that I proposed to you, where 80% of the population supported something, and you suggested, well, what if it's pathological? I'm just wondering, are you perhaps exhibiting this sentence that you wrote here: an intellectual consequence of the experience with Nazism was to effectively shrink and homogenize the language in terms of political debate in the subsequent period? Do you think you've internalized this homogenization?
I think a lot of that has been internalized, yes. And, when I said before, if you look at the available political spectrum in the 30s and 40s, it was dramatically wider than it is now. And what happens with the Cold War is that eventually an entire portion of the spectrum gets cut out, which means that the terms which go into the contests that take place are increasingly thin, and that's what distresses me, I suppose, the most about the present. We'll see what happens. There was a thing on Facebook. That's where it basically said, what we have to do is, vote Trump out and repeal everything that has been passed since then. Well, an awful lot of things have been passed. Among the things which nobody's paying real attention to is the appointment of several hundred judges, all of whom are of a particular political persuasion, and often less than qualified. That's going to make a choice. I can see good potential consequences to it one way or another, because it's not clear to me that one should rely on the courts to one's political business. But that's a longer and more complex issue.
Why is there so much vitriol in the discussion of Carl Schmitt as opposed to discussion of Martin Heidegger? They were both members of the Nazi Party, but
no. There's a lot of vitriol in Heidegger. I mean, it's Emmanuel Faye, who's a French philosopher, has written a book saying all of Heidegger's work should be taken off the philosophy shelves and put into the ideology shelves, the Nazism shelves. There's an enormous amount with Heidegger, especially after the publication of the so-called Black Notebooks recently, which is greatly exaggerated. I would say there's actually more vitriol in relation to Heidegger than there is with Schmidt. Now, some of it is that Schmidt was very important to. I talk about a bit about this in one of the prefaces, to people on the left, there's a wonderful story, which is the philosopher, theologian Jakob Taubes was teaching in Berlin, late 50s, early 60s, and he invited Alexandre Kojève, the French Marxist Hegelian, also one of the architects of the European Union, early European common market. Brilliant man. Invited Kojève to come to Berlin. Kojève came to his talk, said he was going to leave. Taubes said to him, why don't you stay a couple of days? We have all sorts of things to talk about. Kojève said there's only one person worth talking to in Germany, and that's Carl Schmitt. And he went down to see Schmidt in Plettenberg. This is the man of the left. So Schmidt was also when a number of people on the left took up Schmidt's cause, and they did so because they liked his critique of liberalism, sort of from the left and so forth, and they tried to sort of defang Schmidt's nastiness and keep the critique of liberalism. But I wouldn't agree with that it's been more pilloried than Heidegger. The Heidegger stuff recently, especially after the publication of the so-called Black Notebooks, it's been quite vitriolic.
I think my question was the people who cite Schmidt and who write about Schmidt's insights get more pilloried than the people who write about Heidegger. Is that accurate?
I wouldn't say so. I mean, people who I mean, there's there is a certain amount of criticism of people like Chantal Mouffe and so forth as to being too favorable to Schmidt. Ellen Kennedy had just retired from University of Pennsylvania, has received some of the same thing. People who write about Heidegger favorably, have been also, extensively attacked. I mean, all of Richard Woolen's works is Tom Rockmore's work are attacks on people who want to say nice things about Heidegger, and the same with Victor Farias's book in France, the Emmanuel Faye book that I mentioned before. It's the cases. I would say that it runs fairly parallel in terms of attacks. And of course, the two of them, both were members of the Nazi Party, and then neither of them ever apologized. Neither of them, expressed, in fact, any regret for having been so. They both claimed that they were secretly resistant to the Nazi to the party, but hard to know what to make of that.
Are there esoteric and exoteric messages in your work? Because much of it is, within the bounds of conventional discourse, and then there are all these, occasionally these startling insights which seem to kind of break the Overton window. So are you deliberately putting esoteric messages in with your esoteric messages?
George Ketchum once accused me of trying to foster an alliance between Berkeley and Chicago being the esoteric. I don't know how to respond to that, Luke. I don't think that I've done that on purpose. What I do see, and your question makes me see, is that I will sometimes be following a thought out, and a formulation will occur to me which seems just right. And so I'll put it in as a kind of, end point, even though it doesn't quite follow or get developed and so forth in an argumentative fashion. There are passages, and I'm very struck by one of the things that the philosopher Stanley Cavell says about Wittgenstein. He says the passages in Wittgenstein which are so striking that they penetrate past assessment and become part of assessing itself. And I'm not, I can't write that well. If I occasionally try to choose something like that, it's semi-conscious, but I think there's something. I do have an argument in various places as to the limitations of argument as a way of convincing people. Rousseau says at one point, one should convince without persuading. And I've always found that to be an interesting proposition as to how to write.
Is it the non-democratic intellectuals who get you the most intellectually excited?
Oh, that's intriguing. The people who have gotten me, I started out writing, the first book I wrote was on Nietzsche at a time when nobody was doing it. And I wrote about Nietzsche because I was interested in the way the past affects the present and shapes what we do in the future. And I'd originally wanted to write a thesis on the idea of time and political theory, and I didn't know how to do it. Too young and too ignorant. But Nietzsche provided, in some sense, the material to at least approach that question. I got tabbed by the philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre in his book After Virtue as being an example of a left-wing Nietzschean, which was a new category at the time. And as MacIntyre actually said, I got into a big argument with Alan Bloom once about left and right and Nietzsche and so forth. Bloom being, of course, a right wing on the right. The Politics Without Vision book is, with the partial exception of the material on Arendt and the partial exception of the material on Kant, an attempt, in fact, to look for resources for a revised and democratic theory in people who were not Democrats. And in that sense, I am attracted to them because I think their sense of the complexity and the potential tragic qualities of human life are much more prominent and much more, it gives a much thicker, as it were, kind of understanding of the world. On the other hand, I also have written extensively on Rousseau, who, while a Democrat in some sense of term, was accused certainly of having his darker sides. There was a book by a guy named Tolman called The Origins of Totalitarian Democracy, which was all about how nasty Rousseau was. So even the Rousseau attraction is has in partake in some sense of the kind of suggestion that you're making. I've also written extensively on Hobbes, who is, I suppose, closer to, it's no accident that Schmidt is very fond of Hobbes. And I try to, in fact, deal with Hobbes's. I try to make Hobbes actually into a more complex character than he's often taken to be. I am, after all, the son of a Protestant minister, missionary, and grandson of the head of the World's YMCA, and the great grandson of another minister. So there's a kind of, shall we say, theological sympathies, I suppose, which occur, in my way of thinking.
Okay, thank you so much. Sorry, go ahead.
Thank you. What happens to this now?
I will send you a link to this show and the podcast.
Very good. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your time. Take care. Bye-bye.